All right. Welcome, everyone, to Rough Cuts. It's May 18th, and we are on tonight after an incredible Game 1 of the Western Conference Finals, which is why we're here starting a little bit late. Made the game time call to watch the end of the double overtime of the Spurs OKC game instead of starting on time. So, fellas, great game. Welcome.
Good to see you. Yeah, it was a good game.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, great to see you and to be back on here. And we have on with us tonight Chris HOJ as our special guest. Chris, welcome.
Great to be with you guys.
All right. Yeah, we're excited to have you, man. You are obviously venturing over with us into the vintage space here, which we've been seeing you do with a little more frequency lately, which has been awesome. And for those of our listeners, if there are any who are not familiar with Chris, he is, first of all, a voracious collector. I'll lead with that. Of mostly modern and ultra modern, nowadays one of ones, I would say. Some other stuff too, certainly. But and Chris is one of the founders of the Card Ladder pricing tool and business. He is also one of the co-hosts of the great and influential podcast, The Crossover, which has inspired a lot of us in the hobby, including myself, certainly, to get on here and start making some content. So, Chris, I enjoy that show very much, always have, and appreciate that. And then last of all, and perhaps most importantly for tonight, I'd characterize Chris as one of the more thoughtful guys that we have in the hobby. And so, Chris, really glad to have you with us tonight.
What an amazing introduction. Very kind. I think the kindest thing of all was the notion the crossover inspired content from you. That's awesome. I listened to Rough Cuts. I loved you. You had an episode where you guys do these card battles, and you had this series where you were ranking best cards of the eras and stuff. I live for stuff like that. So it's great to be with you guys.
We're pumped to have you on, Chris. And yeah, like Nate said, we definitely consider you a thought leader and an inspiration. And just to welcome you, I only have one of one card in my whole collection. It's an
Topps
Eddie
Gold
George.
Label.
So I just wanted you to feel welcome. So here's a one of one, so you feel like you're, among like-minded folks. Yeah, it's even got the shiny back, the refractory kind of back on it. So
awesome.
Jonathan, you've been doing a 90s run on Instagram this week to get ready to have Chris on, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, I noticed that. Saw some rubies.
Yeah, the Star Rubies. I've got an Essential Credentials in there, a PMG. So yeah, collecting the guys I rooted for in college. They're actually kind of affordable, and the vintage cards lately are just too darn expensive. So gotta go where the prices afford it.
True that. I think we're all dealing with that on some level.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, welcome to some of the folks that we have here in the chat. I see Jeremy Lee, Sports Cards Live, is here. Welcome, Jeremy. YouTube account haver. What's up? Double D's Vintage. Christina's PC with nice hat. Thank you, Christina. I appreciate that. I did sport my Card Ladder hat for tonight, which I got from you at the National this past year. So thank you. Looking forward to a good episode tonight, guys. So we're here to talk about the history and the future of eye appeal stickers, right? Or no,
no.
No, I think that those have been getting enough conversation lately. So something that we talked about and we feel like has not been getting maybe as much hobby attention as it could is the intersection of AI in the hobby. I think AI is getting a lot of attention in probably virtually all other aspects of our lives. Certainly, I know we're thinking and talking about it a lot at my law firm and how it's going to impact our practice of law. And, I use it a lot in just kind of my everyday personal life. And then we're hearing all these news stories this week. It's been Musk and Altman fighting it out in court over the future of OpenAI. I saw there have been some commencement speeches where the recent graduates have been booing the commencement speakers when anytime they reference AI, because it's making it hard for them to get jobs, they feel like. So got this like economic impact. You hear about the infrastructure and national security, private. It's kind of touching all aspects of our lives. So, I think we thought that it would be, kind of interesting to do some thinking and probably a fair bit of hypothesizing about what it might all mean for the hobby in the coming years. So guys, anything kind of initially on the intro, any reactions to that or other avenues that you'd like to bring out initially here? Or
maybe I'll give a disclaimer that we're in the early innings of AI. Can we say that? The early innings. So, right. It's like, gosh, I could say some stuff tonight that might be awful. And just so I would just say that, like, for posterity's sake, let's lower the expectations here and just have some fun.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah, ChatGPT's been out for 4 years, and Claude even less. So yeah, definitely early innings. We'll have to look back in 10 years and see if we got anything right.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you guys to start. What's kind of your overall relationship with and orientation toward AI? How much are you guys using it? Are you using it at all in the hobby? Give us a sense for kind of, some of the thinking you've been doing on it and how much you've been using it. And maybe, Jonathan, do you want to take that one first?
Mine's probably similar to yours, Nate. So I'm a general counsel for a tech company. We're trying to transform everything we do to operate with AI and also infuse AI in our products so customers get value out of it. And it's a complete mindset shift. Every week, I feel like the game is totally changing or something new comes out, and we have no idea where it's all going. It's super helpful, and I feel like every day there's something new you discover where, I used to have to spend all this time doing that, and now a few clicks and I can, you can do it for me. So it's really interesting. It's also not perfect. Sometimes it does hallucinate. So it's probabilistic, not deterministic. So you never know what you're going to get. So it makes things interesting.
Yeah. Every night I actually use AI for something very silly that probably not even many people know I do, which is like one of the last things I do every night working on Card Ladder is I pick a handful of cards that set an interesting sale, and then that creates this ladder headlines email that goes out, but it also gets published to the news feed in the Card Ladder app as well. And so for every time I pick the 3 sales, I try to come up with like a pithy little headline that gets published with them. And it doesn't even go out in the email. It literally is only seen by anybody who clicks the headlines thing in the news feed, which is not many people. But I've been doing it since day one. I just try to come up with a little catchy phrase. Like if Moses Malone sets a new high, it'll be like, Moses makes new market or something. I'll just something. But after doing it for years and years, I got so bored and so like stale that I said, what if I could use ChatGPT to come up with these little lines for me? So every night I show it the 3 sales that I picked, and I ask it to come up with some alliterative title that is like 3 or 4 words long. And what's neat about that is every time I ask it to do it, I always make a mental note to look at my side panel on ChatGPT and see how many different times have I started a thread with it that day. Because I can know when I stopped working on it the previous night, because I can see that's like the last thing that I ask it. I mean, I'm literally doing this like 2 a.m. right before I go to bed. So I do that, and then I look and I see, and on a given day, I'll have like somewhere between 6, 8, and 10 different threads that I've started with ChatGPT on a given day. So that's a pretty good example of how much I use it, and sometimes like I'm kind of just using it as a fancy Google, but some other times, I'm using it to like beat around some ideas and go back and forth. I mean, for me, the use case for AI that I get the most value out of by far is treating it like an omniscient professor that I can go to about any topic or any curiosity, and I can start from any level of knowledge. I can say, treat this as if I'm the most, naive person on the topic, or let's have a more sophisticated discussion. And I just treat it as if I have this professor at my disposal in all disciplines who could teach me whatever I'm curious about. So that's the main mileage I get out of it, Nate.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that's a great usage with the 3-card headlines, something that you've got to do kind of over and over that, right, as you said, started to get a little bit taxing and maybe repetitive, and right, you can just, that's to save that daily mental kind of what probably was fun initially and becomes a grind. That's awesome. And I've had, a few case uses at work where, it's made like, I don't know, a 4-hour project into like a 20-minute project for me. And it can feel almost magical sometimes, right? Like digesting hundreds of pages of documents and giving me the email response that I need. And it still requires a little bit of work, but it's good. And it's recently been helping me with planning a trip to Europe for this summer, like writing the emails to the hotels that I want to stay at and the replies. And so I've been doing, a fair bit of work and personal use on the card side. I feel like it's kind of uneven when I try it still. Like the data that it pulls, I definitely need to do some real double checking on. It'll give me, some inaccurate pops, some, values might be close, but, probably are a little bit off. The information, sometimes just to kind of mess around with it, I'll say something like, is who's a better investment over the next 10 years, Jackie Robinson cards or Mickey Mantle cards, and kind of see what it gives me. And with something like that, like it'll have some decent analysis, but nothing that I find like incredibly insightful yet. So that's a little bit about kind of where I am with
it's in the days where everybody has access to AI. Something we say a lot in software is the data becomes kind of the data is the most important thing. So I imagine, Chris, for Card Ladder, you're thinking, like how is over time, like what are all the different modalities in which people might access this amazing data set? Because without the data of all the sales, it really doesn't know, right? It's going to look at what's out there on Google or Reddit and grab some stale data when telling you how much your 1954 PSA 7 Jackie Robinson is, and who knows. So it's going to be really interesting with AI to see how the data sets of values are either locked down more or opened up, or how you can access them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. I love AI in general, whether it's in a hobby context or otherwise. I love it for its reasoning capabilities, which is one of the great ironies of AI, was that there was like this thinking that AI is going to replace like the mathematical, mechanistic jobs, but instead, it's the thing that it really seems to be good at are the more human things, like the reasoning and the creative stuff and generating images. And so I'd like to use, so to your point, Jonathan, I think you're exactly right that like AI, the mileage that I'm going to be able to get out of it is directly related to the quality of data that I feed into it. Now, granted, if I'm treating it as sort of like a general model, and I know that it's got access to all of the lectures and history books in a subject or whatever, great. It's like, I'm sure that's fine. I don't need to feed it the data. But if I'm asking it to actually do something like calculate something for me, it is 100% incumbent on me to make sure it has the right data. So like, Nate, you know that I love like the total MVPs thing, right?
Yeah.
So if I wanted to, if I'm like sitting there, I'm like, you know what? I've never looked up who has the most total MVPs in hockey. So I would love to use ChatGPT to perform that. But before I can trust it to do that, I need to say, okay, go to this website, extract, and then put into a table all of these MVPs from this source, and then spit it back out to me. And then I'm going to spot check 10 of them, and I'm going to tell it to spot check 10 of them. And then once I'm confident that it got that data right, then I'll say, go get the Stanley Cup MVP winners, and then bring them into a table, and then turn that into its own table, and then I'm still going to spot check that too. So getting the data right, like I fully believe in its ability to reason, notwithstanding hallucination concerns, which are very real. But making sure it gets the data right, making sure the inputs are right, that's where I have to be super careful.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Yeah, it has to be a really iterative process. You can't just trust what it spits out. And right, yeah, and right, double checking. And sometimes what I actually do is I'll get an answer in Claude and then I'll feed it into chat, and to kind of double check, do the layers of AI as well. But funny comment here from YouTube account haver Jonathan, I think you had highlighted. He said, though its hallucinations can be wild, as it has described to me the incredible qualities of the Red Heart Jackie Robinson, which is a card that does not exist. So it's we encounter these hallucinations in law. One of the big things is it makes up legal cases, and a lot of lawyers have been cited by judges and had sanctions brought against them and stuff for bringing into court cases that don't exist. So you definitely have to be careful. And speaking of that, kind of moving into one of our first sort of nuts and bolts hobby topics here, counterfeits and fakes. So, I think that's something that people really kind of worry about with the advances that we're seeing in AI and 3D printing. And it feels almost like there's a bit of an arms race between the authenticators and the folks, the would-be counterfeiters trying to pass this stuff off. And certainly I think we could see possibilities for that getting even more pronounced in the coming years. So Chris, any thoughts on that one? Any have you seen counterfeiting becoming an even greater issue? Do you have a view on who's likely to win that arms race, if we can characterize it as that?
Yeah, it's a scary topic. Ironically, in preparation for the show, and just because of like the meta aspect of this, I said, I'm going to take the outline that you provided and I'm going to give it to ChatGPT. And I'm going to say, what do you think Chris HOJ would say to all these questions? And I didn't really like much of what it gave me, honestly, but it gave me some interesting things on this question. Some of the things it was saying was, well, if the authenticators are able to build large databases of historical photos that show from a variety of angles and slightly different light, a big database, a big sample of like what the authentic versions of this card look like, that can be a big advantage in training an AI model to be able to detect things that are not completely consistent with that. But the other side of the coin, which is what you brought up, is that what about if the bad guys start using those same capabilities? Like, what if they go and grab 1,000 different photos of a specific card and feed it into an AI model and try to train it to produce a counterfeit? Like I've had some success when I put pictures of cards into AI and just sort of say, hey, could you what if you swapped out this player and made this imaginary card of the other player? And then it'll look pretty darn good. And I'm sure if somebody sat there and really worked at it and massaged the result, they could make it even better. But I think one of the bottlenecks in counterfeiting that's always been there, and granted, I don't know a ton about 3D printing or access to those type of materials, but one of the bottlenecks to counterfeiting historically has been it's just tough for people to get their hands on the right set of equipment that's needed to produce cards that can pass detection, or that can evade detection, I should say. And even like card manufacturing at scale, it can be tough for those guys to find printers domestically or internationally that can actually print as many cards as they want to print. It's tough to get access to the materials and the machinery. So my perhaps naive hope is that there will still be difficulty at the physical manufacturing level that will make it tough to do counterfeits.
I also think I think overall counterfeiting or AI will benefit, like you started, Chris, the ability of humans to detect counterfeits more so than to manufacture counterfeit cards. And I think we're seeing some of this in the comments as well. But I think, and I don't know if AI will be able to smell anytime soon, but like the tactile, when in the vintage world, the feel of these old cards and even the smell of them is one of the easiest ways you tell if it's real or not. And those things are just almost impossible to imagine counterfeiting for the vintage world. And then the modern world, we'll see how technology and serial numbering and databases and stuff combat that. The part that I'm really worried about, and I actually think there will be a line in history that we've probably already crossed, is the in-person autograph. Will you'd have to assume a robot could have done it, because I think it's already possible today with robotics, and I imagine in 10 years robots will be doing all kinds of things. They can just look at any signature and forge it. I even wonder if humans will move away from the signature entirely as a way that we authenticate documents. So I think there will be, for the pack pulled stuff that's already got, some indicia of authenticity, maybe that's still fine, because the companies themselves make sure that the athlete signed it. But for a card that was just signed, now, like Nate's Mickey Mantle autograph was authenticated by PSA long before these robots could have done it. But I think there will be sort of a time when in-person autographs are sort of assumed to potentially be fraudulent, unless there's some other proof.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Jonathan, right? There might be a premium, potentially a substantial premium for old slabbed cards, right? That kind of, whatever that delineation point is ultimately deemed to be, if you have something legitimately slabbed prior to that, it could have, more value and much greater certainty about the authenticity. And I think I tend to agree with you guys as well that, on the cards, it seems like the good guys are probably in a little better position. One of the other big advantages, and as much as a lot of people get frustrated with PSA, and I'm certainly one of them sometimes, like, they're so big, they're making such tremendous investments into all of this, and eBay as well. I mean, look at the eBay authenticity program that they started a couple years ago, and I think PSA just last week announced a $200 million investment, a lot of it into infrastructure and technology. I mean, these guys, these big companies in the space understand where this is going. And I think, with eBay, for example, it's not just about the cards, but it's also about the ability to counterfeit the slabs, right? And come up with really good looking PSA slabs. And, PSA can have embedded technology that can make that a little more challenging, but to some degree, it's going to be on the, not just the graders and authenticators to get that right, but also the rest of the hobby. So the auction houses, the eBays, us as the collectors, we're going to need to scan a card that's in a slab to make sure that scan the slab to make sure that that's legit. And maybe, buy it from an auction house that has some real technology, or, so I think there's going to be kind of more and more levels to the authentication process.
Nate, you've introduced a compelling case that we finally do need grading of the graders, or maybe authentication of the graders. And eBay is well positioned there simply because they've already implemented this authentication process that, as its core, when it's dealing with graded cards, it's mainly inspecting to make sure that the slab itself is authentic. So, that's an interesting point. I want to ask Jonathan, you said, I was so curious about this idea of humans moving away from the signature as a way to authenticate a document. What would be the alternative? Is what, like, because I've always sort of thought of the signature as like, there's probably a lot of forged documents. Like, my signature can look very different from paper to paper. Like, or at least when I was in law school, they taught me that the signature is more of a ritual. It's more like you are putting pen to paper to sort of formalize something, and that the authentication of it is more so that, like, people saw you sign it, and so there's witnesses to the signature. So I'm wondering, I'm earnestly wondering, what might we actually replace the signature with that could serve the same purpose?
Yeah, it could be, I'm thinking of Mission Impossible movies. It could be a thumbprint with a retinal scan at the same time, or a digital kind of footprint, or like I imagine there would be some physical act with a bunch of digital record around it and metadata, and maybe that metadata is blockchain stored in the future to where it's there's a pretty concrete evidence that this person was here and intended to sign the document. But
Awesome.
Yeah,
Or
there's
like,
a lot of tradition in the way, but I do think at some point in time the signature ceases to be very good proof that somebody signed it, because
it was, you kind of like shocked my world when you said that, and then I was like, yeah, he's right. He is completely right. Or like Pat says here, one strand of hair. How about a strand of hair? It's
Right.
authenticated document. Some of us don't have many left, Pat.
That's right. Yeah. So, related topic, grading. Obviously the two key elements with the PSAs of the world, SGC, Beckett, are the authentication piece and the grading. We've had some folks like Tag Grading move toward an AI-based system. And my understanding is that, PSA in particular, again, has made a lot of investment into this, and they have AI at least doing pieces of it, like maybe, measuring the cards, giving an exact reading on the centering percentages, probably some elements of authenticity verification even at this point, but they still ultimately have humans kind of calling the balls and strikes on what the grade is. What do you think on this one, Jonathan, in terms of where this is headed? Do we keep the human umpires, or do we go toward the robots as an industry?
I'll give you a quick thought, and then I'm going to tell a brief anecdote where I can see big reverberations of this. First of all, if you're any technology company right now, you are demanding of yourself, your executives and your board are demanding AI transformation, right? So if your PSA, your SGC, your Beckett, your Tag, you're asking, how can we utilize this technology better for efficiencies, better quality outcomes, transformation? So there's no question they're all having the conversation. They have to be.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably the outcome. It's not that interesting to me to sort of ponder of like, do humans also call the balls and strikes, or do you just use the tool? But like, there's going to be tools that can grade a card, and I imagine pretty democratized over time. Why this is interesting to me, it reminded of an anecdote. I've told it before, but a few nationals ago in Chicago, I got invited to kind of a high rollers dinner. A small group of folks. I had a work connection to one of them, but I learned throughout the dinner that a few of them owned T206 Hannes Wagner's. One of them owned a PSA 9 52 tops mantle. I actually I started talking about this news story where one of the PSA 9 mantles was believed to have been trimmed. And I didn't know at the time that I was having dinner with the owner of that very card. So it was a little bit of a foot in my mouth moment. But I learned about these collectors over the course of the dinner, that they were like, hey, once the number's on the slab, who cares? Like, who cares if it's trimmed? Who cares if it's over undergraded? They were, I mean, these were very, very wealthy, high-end collectors. And it was just like, the number is the number, and we'll pay what it costs. And that was sort of the realm of the hobby they existed in. I think it's going to be really interesting when we stop pretending that the cards stop aging as soon as they're put in the slab. First of all, like, we've seen Gouty Ruths that are clearly like washed out in the sun, probably after they were graded, or cards that have been damaged. They age over time, and also standards change over time. So I envision pretty soon there to be some new AI grading tools that are pretty democratized, pretty readily accessible, where we're running it on cards that somebody paid $5 million for, and it says like, yeah, that's a PSA 6 today. And it's going to be really interesting to see if sort of the prevailing view of the high rollers say like, no, all that really matters is the number on the slab. Or if you see a little bit of a loss of credibility into what some guy calling balls and strikes 20 years ago said about the card, and we all kind of say, actually, this AI tool is more reliable. So I think there's a risk factor out there for folks who have just bought the number on the slab.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Kind of the opposite of the other point on autographs, right? Where you want the earlier slab. Now you want the later slab that's maybe going to be a little more reliable. And right, I've thought about that at some points too. Like, do all the human graded cards at some point need to be regraded by a technology that we, at some point all deem to be more accurate? Because one of the things, obviously, that gets, PSA gets a tremendous amount of grief for is their grading inconsistency, right? We've seen people, I've sent it in one time and it was an 8, then it was a 10, then it was a 6, and I think the allure of the machine grading is to try to minimize some of that inconsistency. But Chris, and any thoughts on where this is headed?
Terrific points. And I was going to go into the consistency direction, and you just nailed it. So there's no need to cover that. But I do have something else though, and it kind of dovetails with the consistency thing. So I think like AI grading as a marketing slogan is very appealing because it implies consistency. How could a computer contradict itself? That's one of the things that we count on programming to not do. But AI isn't quite programming. It's something a little bit different than that. It actually, AIs sort of can hallucinate. Sometimes they can make mistakes too. And also the AI is always only going to be as good as its training materials and as good as its model. And so, for that reason, the AI is, I think, going to be more prone to make obvious mistakes. Like humans can make mistakes too. A human might grade a card a 6 that should be an 8 or vice versa. But an AI might grade a card a 9 that should be a 2 because it has this gentle crease that runs directly down its center that the scans and the imaging didn't quite pick up.
Right.
And I think in the context of grading in particular, like take a company like, let's do one that I'm not associated with. Let's take CGC. CGC probably has a 99% accuracy rate, but that's kind of like a little imprecise. I would say the overwhelming majority of the time, their grader produces a consistent, replicable result. Or even if you don't agree with that, just stipulate to that for the sake of this thought experiment. Yep. That 1% time when they miss big, it's so loud. Everybody sees it. That's the thing that gets the headline. That's the thing that circles the room. That's the thing that people will discuss. That's the thing that people will point to and say, this is why grading is a big problem. So when you have human graders, ideally, and especially if you have like a second, like one person grades it, and then there's a quality check, and then maybe another check before it gets finally sealed. Humans hopefully will catch these big errors, and humans will still make the smaller error, but they'll hopefully they'll catch the big ones. But the AI won't know if it misses a big or a small mistake. It will do it. And so I think the risk with AI is that an AI grading system that doesn't have a human at the end of the line sort of double checking it. And if you're going to have human at the line double checking it, you might as well have them take a few seconds to look at the card too. If you don't have that at the end of the line, you can get some of the loudest mistakes that are going to provide really negative PR that I think the grading companies want to avoid. I think that's a real existential risk with AI grading without a human there to sort of put a bow on it and make sure everything went properly and went right. And like I said, if you're going to have a human do that, you might as well probably have them take a little extra time and just grade the card too. And it doesn't hurt to have the AI sort of set the template or set you up or get you part of the way there. But you really want to have a human there to make sure that the big mistake gets caught.
Yeah. It's a great point. Yeah. And right. We on the vintage side deal with cards, with all sorts of imperfections, and the one you described is a really interesting one. And, we've all seen scans many times of 2 or a 3 or a 1 sometimes, and it looks beautiful. And then you get the card in hand and you're like, oh, well, yeah, now I see why it's a 1. There's a big crease that didn't show up in the scan. And you may have seen a few different scans, but it only shows up from a certain angle. And that's one of the things that I've wondered about the ability for AI to grade is, it can take a while sometimes. Like a card looks like an 8 and you're like, I know there's something wrong with it. And you have to look at it under all these different lights from maybe hundreds or thousands of angles to finally get the exact right one to see what's wrong with it, that grader saw. I don't know. I don't know about the level of machine sight and ability to be that exacting. And I mean, I guess it'd be interesting to know what some of Tag's experiences have been. Because what you described, Chris, seems really intuitive to me, and that there would be some of those big misses. Are either of you guys, do you have any anecdotal stories or evidence coming out of Tag yet? Have you heard like how consistent they seem to be? Have you heard of any big misses by them or know much about their process?
There's always a few examples.
Yeah.
Where there's been a case, and again, I'm reading this on social media, so maybe it's fake news, so I don't want to repeat the specifics, and I don't want to name any specific grading company, but there's been the appearance of it circulating that one grading company graded it this way, a different one graded it this way. The discrepancy was gigantic. It's because the prior company missed something. Now, one of the areas that I think Tag, like, hats off to Tag, like they've built a growing, burgeoning business, and they found a niche, and it's been really impressive how they've sustained and built and grown. But one of the things where, like, they and any AI related grading enterprise is going to stumble a little bit too is in the field of identification. So, sometimes just because of the lighting of the imaging and stuff, it can be tough to know if it's this parallel or that parallel. And so there's been a few examples, and it's not unique to any grading company. All the grading companies make these mistakes, but I suppose it's maybe evidence that AI centered grading can make the mistakes too. If there's an improper identification, that's just like that's just a blemish that compounds, because once it gets out into the world, and every time it gets listed for sale or it gets sold or it gets resold, it's just the same mistakes. It's like, oh, that's not what the card is. It got misidentified. And again, identification is an important piece to grading. Grading is assessing technical condition, it's authenticating, it's identifying, and it's classifying. And the classification systems and the identification system sometimes can get overlooked, but that's a really important part of grading too. What that cert says, and what set the company believes it belongs to, and how they came to that conclusion, and how they identified the card. Those are things where AI can make mistakes too.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another thing. I don't know if Tag does the grading just based on two-dimensional scans. But one thing, I'll just say this for posterity. Where are we right now in AI? We're mostly in a world where it exists on a digital two-dimensional surface, but AI is starting to invade our 3D world. If you've been to San Francisco lately, AI is driving cars around the city. AI is running, robots running marathons. I think most of us aren't interacting with them on a daily basis. But my point is, I envision not too far from now that the AI used to authenticate cards, grade cards, classify cards will be more than just 2D imaging, but there will be some sort of a three-dimensional scan that it's analyzing of a card with a lot of lighting around it. I imagine at some point in time, an AI robot will be able to handle a card, but that feels pretty far off. If you imagine like how fragile it is, right, of holding, imagine holding a raw 1914 Cracker Jack card. That feels pretty far off that there's a robot that can do that, but it's probably going to happen. So yeah, I do think in terms of how humans work with AI and machines to evaluate cards, eventually there is kind of a physical act that's beyond just kind of 2D imaging.
Yeah. And I'd say, for what it's worth, from my perspective, the longer we stay human grading, the better. That's kind of my take on baseball too. Like, I'm not rushing to have. Yeah. I feel like
I'm there too.
And it's kind of a hobby. It's like I think more of a collector view than like an industry or business view, right? Like, there's a romanticism about the misses and the inconsistencies, and there's also opportunity there. And in baseball, like, it's part of the game. Like, there's some balls and strikes are going to be missed, and here, grading's not going to be 100% accurate, and we just deal with it. It's part of our hobby. It's part of the excitement and the mystery of what we do, and it creates opportunities for all of us. So I don't need perfect consistency. I'd rather have humans doing it. I'd rather have the human jobs.
And even board game players, strategic board games, are shown to like some element of randomness in the game. It actually makes it more fun. And in some ways,
right,
the human touch kind of creates that in the gamification of everything we're doing.
Right. Yeah. So moving on then to kind of access to information and knowledge. And, you know, this is an area where, you know, Chris, what you guys have done with Card Ladder, I think has already, you know, had a huge impact. And, you know, certainly what the grading companies have done before that, you know, with creating pop reports. And then, you know, we now have access to real-time data on sales. And, you know, the knowledge and the data that we have now is so much different than it was 10 years ago, which was so much different than 20. And that's really helped to, you know, in a lot of ways, grow and make the hobby more accessible and more trustworthy. And we understand what we're dealing with and working with when we go up to a table at a show and we see a card and we see a price on it. It's not just pulled out of some guy's head based on, you know, whatever factors he decided to go with that day. There's, you know, some real data that underlies that. And it seems, you know, with where we're headed, that we're going to be getting more and more of that. So, you know, a hypothetical that I came up with was, you know, you walk up to that table, you pick up a T206 red tie cob, PSA2, you scan it, and you see the, you know, global pop report data from all companies, every comp that's come out and how often the card sells in all grades, an AI generated eye appeal analysis and scoring. And that could be set to your preferences if you'd like. So if you value registration or centering more, it can score it like on a general scale and on your scale. The provenance maybe for that card, to the extent that that's been publicly accessible, who's owned it before this particular dealer or seller, what's the history of it? You know, where's it been over the last 10, 20, 30 years, to the extent that we can track that. Every other reasonably comparable example that's publicly available at this time. So how do I like this one compared to the other 11 PSA2 red portrait cobs that are available right now, either at auction or from other dealers at the show or on eBay or wherever else? And then maybe an AI value that's pretty reliable based on all the accessible data. You know, it's amalgamating all the different comps, the pops, the pricing trends, the other available cards, and maybe it gives you a score of 1 to 10 on its view on whether you should buy the card. So, you know, something where it just applies all this additional kind of thought, data, and knowledge to you know, some of the decision making and some of our understanding of the cards, you know, that we're thinking about. So, and you know, to me, that world actually like doesn't feel all that far away. So, you know, and I think that the data and information that we've gotten access to already have been kind of transformative in terms of, you know, how the hobby has grown. It, you know, I think played a huge factor. What do you guys think about having everyone having all that type of data at their fingertips? Is that going to happen? What does that mean for the hobby? Is it going to facilitate more growth? Chris, you want to start on this one?
Yeah, it's amazing. Like you just described like a sci-fi hobby world, which sounds like a lot of fun. And you start to think, like, I think maybe at first, like gut check reaction would be like, well, then what am I going to do? You know, like in other words, you kind of described the process that a seasoned collector who would be looking at that card would probably do something similar to that manually.
Yeah.
But then I think the reaction to that is like, well, if I don't have to spend all the time looking at all that stuff and figuring that stuff out, if I sort of have a model that can do that for me, and especially if I sort of iterate with that model and train that model to think how I want it to think, that frees up my mind to think about all types of other stuff that we can't even imagine right now. Like once we have those tools built, we can then build something on top of that we can use our creative powers towards. So it's exciting. It's an exciting world. And I think what you nailed, what you put your finger on, is that, and it kind of harkens back to something I was saying at the outset, to the extent that the AI is modeling human reasoning and sort of synthesizing pieces of information and even doing it at scale. Like if you're looking, if the AI can look at 100 comps instantly, if we're looking at them, we have to eyeball them and then sort of approximate the calculation in our head. Well, it looks like it's gone up about this much, and the AI can actually model that with great precision instantly. But to the extent the AI is modeling human reasoning, it's going to do a pretty good job. The hard part is going to be making sure that it has good data to start with. That's always going to be the hard part, at least at this part, at this juncture in the AI realm. That's going to be the tough part. Like, and so you need to build an AI tool like that on top of a data infrastructure that is thorough and complete and so on and so forth, clean, vetted, etc. That's going to be the tough part, is making sure that the pop reports that it's fetching are correct, that the sales that it's fetching are correct, that the images that it's getting are true representations and they haven't been pixelated, or that they're not hallucinating, or that they're not regenerating them. Those are going to be the tough parts. But the logic, the reasoning, the ability for a tool to do what you described is I think it is feasible. I think it could be done right now if the AI had the inputs.
What I imagined when you were describing all that, Nate, was Yahoo Finance. I kind of thought, like, yeah, essentially Yahoo Finance is a free research tool for stocks, and AI will essentially enable something pretty similar for cards. And I think that the access that will afford will probably bring more people into buying and selling cards, just like I think Yahoo Finance and similar tools have made more people day trade stocks. There will still be a lot of old school people that have never touched Yahoo Finance, and they just kind of buy boring index funds or put their money in IBM, and they're good to go, and they've done well. But I think so it'll be more flavors for people that want them. But the really serious traders still to this day have like a subscription to Bloomberg Finance terminals that's like $20,000 a month. There's like, so the people that want the really, really, really powerful tools and data sets will pay a lot more for it. I think the providers of data will probably evolve their business models to both license data to like the democratized tools like the Yahoo Finance of cards, as well as higher end platforms. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it all evolves. But I was also imagining there's going to be new jobs where people, just like in the stock world, are kind of have buy ratings and sell ratings on stocks. You'll see that in your AI card platform of different influencers and thought leaders and what they say about, yeah, you should really be putting your money into Satchel Paige right now. He's going to have a great season coming up.
Nice. Yeah. And, I agree with all that. And, I think the part that's, Chris, one of the things that you said is that's kind of what we do when we walk up to a table. But I think when you say we, you mean the guy that's been doing this for 5 or 10 or 15, and has learned, over the course of taking some bumps and bruises and having a lot of misses and not knowing any of that for the first. And so one of the things that's kind of exciting to me is that like people are going to be able to get up to speed probably a lot faster as they understand how to use these tools. And it can really, kind of accelerate that learning and that ability to make thoughtful decisions. And, might we be able to bring people over from the gambling side of cards to the collecting side of cards a little faster if one of those outputs is, okay, I want to buy $200 worth of cards and I can join a box break, or I can buy a repack, or I can invest it in this Hall of Fame rookie card. Tell me what that investment looks like for me 5 or 10 years from now. And the box break, the $200 goes to 20 and the repack goes to 40 and the Hall of Fame rookie card goes to 400. Like can people kind of get smarter about what they're doing faster? Can we get more collectors because people understand kind of what to do? And do we knock down some of those barriers to being able to kind of, do it at a high level? That's the part that's kind of where I hope it goes.
Great. You made great points. I think it could. I think it absolutely could make and open up it could sharpen the learning curve, or I don't know, however you would say that, to say that people can go along the learning curve much faster. They could get to a point of maturity and sophistication much faster. So I think you're right. I think that can help, but I don't know. But I think there's always going to be a learning curve, because at some level, you still need to understand what's going on underneath the hood in order for any of it to make sense. Like I can have a calculator perform a massive multiplication function for me, and I couldn't do it in my head, and it would take me a while to do it by hand. But I do understand the mechanics of multiplication. I understand at a fundamental level what's happening. And so a collector is still going to need to sort of understand on a fundamental level what it means for an artificial intelligence model to look at 20 recent sales of this card and then the 20 most recent sales of the 20 most adjacent cards, and sort of estimate where that where a good buying range might be for the specific card that's on the table in front of you. That collector is still going to need to sort of have done that for themselves to understand what the underlying mechanics of that thought process are in order for them to actually make use of it. Otherwise, they're just, they're sort of putting their collecting experience on autopilot. And that could, maybe that could work out, but I don't even, but then at that point I start questioning, well, why are they collecting then? Like at that point, the collecting has to be appealing to something other than sort of the research and the thrill of the hunt and the joy of acquisition and stuff. Like, so that's where it starts to go a little fuzzy for me.
Yeah. Also, there's so many. Think about the really rare cards that some of us collect, where the last comp might be 2 years ago, and so then there's the time value for you of waiting. There's what else has gone in the market over that period of time. There's so much in the hobby around scarcity where comps don't really tell you everything, and you can't just have a tool tell you what it's worth. But there's all these kind of risk factors of like, well, if you really weight these things, it could be worth 3x that if you weight these other things. So there's so much human judgment that goes into it that you can't just rely on a tool to say the card is worth this. And so, yeah, I think the collectors will always bring points of view into it and, assessments of risk and market conditions to make decisions.
Yeah. Right. You still got to know the right questions to ask. And ultimately it comes down to human and collector judgment on what you're going to do. Yeah. Good point. So we talked a little bit ago, toward the beginning about the game that we watched tonight. And I think we can all probably stipulate that Wemby is the greatest basketball player of all time at this point, right? But, kind of moving into our next topic here, which is GOAT debates, hierarchies of players that we collect, how we think about those things, new ideas on and access to analytics and analytical thinking and rankings of players. So these are all things that kind of underpin the card market, the card hobby, and how we all think about who we collect. Some people tend to gravitate more toward the sort of mythologized folks like the Mickey Mantles, so
Babe Ruth.
Yeah, right. Cultural phenomenon, Mantles, Bo Jacksons, Jackie Robinson, maybe even could go, Kobe, and then some folks go more toward, the guys that have just done it on the court or on the field, the Brady, Jordan, LeBron. So how might some of the new thinking and knowledge that comes out of AI, how might it upend some of how we think about who the GOATs are, how we think about who we collect, who might benefit from some of this? What are, what kind of directions could you see some of that new knowledge going? Jonathan, do you have some thoughts on this one?
I think what it really changes is velocity. If you think about what generative AI is, it's a remixing of trained data sets. And so there's an ability. I've had lots of these debates with ChatGPT and Claude. I'm sure all of us have. But what it's doing is it's going out there, it's looking at statistical data sets, and it's looking at arguments that have been made, and it's rehabbing them. But it enables you to do that at pace that you've never done before. And then as we start to be interested in different metrics, it can also go look at a big data set, and we might not have, the back of the baseball card at that time didn't track that metric, but we can go, like, AI is so good at looking at big, broad data sets, pulling out what you're looking for and analyzing it. So I don't think it fundamentally changes these debates, but it enables us to kind of do them over and over and over in different and new ways that I think keeps the debate alive and it keeps it fun. So I'm all for it. I don't think it'll settle anything. I don't think AI can kind of definitively solve any of these age-old conundrums of, but what if basketball players are better today? Does it matter that Bill Russell won 11 titles? Like, we're all going to continue to disagree about these age-old conundrums.
Right. Chris, what do you think? Is the total MVP metric gonna hold up through the age of AI as the GOAT?
It's not even holding up now, Nate. People hate that metric. But the metric is like a concession, right? The metric, the vision behind that metric is it's where the stat nerds and the ball knowers can overlap, and we can all agree that at least this is a thing that happened. But okay, so I have two trains of thought here. The first one is harkening back to the point again from earlier in the show, where here's where AI can be so helpful here. I used ChatGPT, and this was about 1.5 years ago now, to teach me how several of the big advanced metrics in basketball work, and not just like give me a paragraph that summarizes what happened or take me to the author of the model's like biography page and tell me some inspirational story. I literally had it break down plus minus modeling to its most core fundamental pieces, and I had it teach me from scratch how it worked. And I simultaneous to that, it was teaching me sort of the history of it, like when did adjusted plus minus modeling enter the stage? And that was around 2004 with some breakthroughs. And then they realized some of the problems that they were having with it. So then regularized adjusted plus minus enters the stage around 2010. And then eventually you get Daniel Myers's box plus minus in 2014. And then you get Jeremiah Engelman's XRAPM in the late 2010s. And like, I went through the whole history of it, and I had it literally teach me how it works, teach me how adjusted plus minus modeling is one of the brilliant breakthroughs in basketball modeling. The idea being that if you want to find out what the impact is of a player, you don't look at their statistics. You don't have to look at them at all. It doesn't matter what the field goal percentage, doesn't matter what they shot. All you need to look at is have a large enough data set where you can control for when that player is in and out with a variety of different lineups. That's all that adjusted plus minus modeling is okay, what does Victor Wembanyama look like when he's on the floor with these four guys? And then what does the game look like when those four guys on the floor, but Luke Cornett's there instead? And then you also have to control for the other players in the other team too. But in each time a player subs in or out, it's called a stint. In those stints, you get hundreds of thousands of stints over the course of a season, and then eventually millions over multiple seasons. And eventually you get this huge data set that can measure to some degree. It's noisy, but it can measure impact. And so I spent like a few weeks teaching myself this, and I just loved it. And it gave me such an appreciation for plus minus modeling. And it showed me its strengths and its weaknesses. It showed me where it can be noisy. It showed me where it can be helpful. It gave me an appreciation for Daniel Myers's box plus minus, which it attempts to control for the small sample size issue by taking like 20 or 15 or 20 year RAPM samples and then modeling them against positions and statistical stuff. Anyway, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, just to say that like AI can, if there's a stat that interests you, and in basketball, the plus minus modeling stuff is fascinating. AI can teach that to you. You just have to have the patience to walk it through teaching it to you. So that's one breakthrough, I think, is making sophisticated statistical models accessible to lay people who have the time and the patience to want to learn them, but don't have who aren't taking courses in sports science at the local college. Like, you can have an AI teach it to you, and it can be extremely exciting. Then the other train of thought that I had was this, the eye test. Okay. Even though we have great models, and in basketball, we have a dozen great models that attempt to all answer similar questions, sometimes the same question. We have estimated plus minus, we have Darko, we have drip, we have box plus minus, we have win shares per 48, we have player efficiency rating, we have XRAPM, we have RAPM, we have RPM, we have all these models. But even though they all exist, most sports fans, most voters on awards don't want to take those few weeks to learn these statistical methods. They would rather just go to the eye test. And it's never going to matter, I think, how great the models are. And in fact, there's almost this inverse relationship where the better the model is, more likely the more sophisticated it is, the more likely it requires a lot of processing, and it's a big data model that's very difficult to understand. And the likelier that the model is more difficult to understand, the likelier it is that people are not going to want to listen to it at all, because it's like, I have to go through all this to even understand what it's doing. I can't even intuitively grasp what's going on here. So I think that actually the better the models get, maybe the less people are going to look to rely on them. Now, the professionals might rely on them, and maybe even some of the media and the awards voters will try to learn them and rely on them. But the average fan, the casual person, the people who pay the salaries, who pay the tickets, who go to sit in the seats, who buy the popcorn, those people are always going to have their eye test, and they're going to cling to that eye test, I think, even more as the models get scarier and more complex and more difficult to grasp. So there's always going to be that eye test factor. And also, the eye test too, even if we could understand the models, we don't want to outsource our judgment to some rigid and possibly determinative method of thinking when we're just trying to have fun. We just want to watch a sport and feel like we know what we're talking about and have an opinion. And I don't think we're ever going to want to give that up. I think that's something that we're going to defend to the end.
I think this is the first time in the conversation where someone really articulately sort of framed the tension of what is it that makes our humanity? Like, what's the essence of that, pushing against this data set, AI, artificial intelligence? And there is this tension. And I've often, over the course of several years, Chris, in the collecting world, talked about it doesn't really matter who the best player was statistically or objectively, or if Mickey Mantle was the 7th best baseball player ever or the 20th best. It doesn't really matter, because as collectors, people are captured by stories. We're even imperfections and what could have beens, and what you just said was the eye test. But I think it's so fascinating and very well put that we as collectors, regardless of what this perfectly reasonable objective system is, we're going to push back and say, like, nah. I think I don't care how that model says Jokic is the best player of all time. Like, I like Kobe, and that's ultimately how people want to decide.
Yeah. Great stuff. One of the places that my mind goes with it as well is like simulations. Like, could we simulate what Bo Jackson's career would have been like if he'd had access to modern hip surgeries, right? And like in a way that's reliable. And is that interesting? Does that change thoughts on him? Like, if we could see that, I don't know, he would have hit 500 home runs and rushed for 15,000 yards, and we believe it because we trust the data. And that's probably more like maybe 15 years out or something. What if we could actually really simulate Wilt Chamberlain having access to modern training methods for a few years and then participating in a current NBA season? What if we could give Babe Ruth at bats against Randy Johnson? Like, I don't know. Some of these things could be really fun. And, to your point about, like, it's got to stay fun and human, like all these curiosities that we've had as fans, like there could at some point, I think stuff like that to be reliable is a little further down the road. But do you think some stuff like that could have an impact on how we, Mantle, like what we all talk about, he always comes up, what would his career have been if he wouldn't have stepped in that hole in the outfield? And what was it, his rookie year or his second year, and screwed up his knee and, had all the knee surgeries? How many home runs would he have hit? Like, do we, and maybe what we're ultimately getting at with these types of conversations and potential simulations is, at its core, who was the most talented athlete of all time? Not like who had the most career. And maybe that's fundamentally boring too, because like we want the story and we want all the warts and everything else that comes along with it. But I, at least as a fan, feel like some of that stuff could be pretty interesting to have some better answers to.
I almost feel like it'll always be science fiction. These AI, I don't believe that it could truly predict what would have happened if Bill Russell had hip surgery. Even a surgeon today couldn't predict that. But as I listened to you, I thought it's just more avenues for people to play, which I think it's like we're kind of video gamifying fandom and collecting and history of like, hey, here's some tools, create your own fan fiction of, Mickey Mantle that never hurt his knee, and have some analytical tools that help with that. So I think there's a lot of fun to be had. I don't know if it'll ultimately change the way we think about them, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've created almost a new category, Nate. The category of the in theory top performer. And I think it could be a thing that we don't really have access to the tools to like measure that right now. It's more imaginary, but if it became a little more substantive and firm, I think it could become a real category. Like it could become a way that we think about sports that we just don't think about it right now. But it's like for a guy like Bo Jackson, like I think like the way things stand right now is that I think anybody who is likely to believe that story to begin with is going to run to this and love it. But I don't know if it's going to move anybody on the fence, or definitely I don't know if it's going to bring anybody over the fence. Now, here's something I was thinking about when you were talking to Nate, was that there's a book by Ben Taylor called Thinking Basketball, which is like 10 or 15 years old now. And I read it a long time ago and I don't remember the specifics, but I remember he had a super interesting footnote where he goes into depth about a study that was run. And I don't remember the methodology. I don't remember how they determined this, but I remember what the bottom line was. The takeaway was that in the NBA, in order to have a confidence level greater than 95% that the better team won, that the length of every playoff series would need to be 25 games. So even when we look at the things that have happened today and we sort of assume, well, the best team must have won. Well, not according to that study. Ben Taylor was advancing the idea that there are plenty of outcomes where a 7-game series may or may not be giving us the better team actually winning. So you could even simulate every season, but it becomes sort of a question like, well, what's the baseline? Like is the baseline to determine what team was better? Are we measuring that against how each team performed in the regular season, or like how do we, so I think it opens up a lot of questions, but I like it. I think it's an interesting idea to go down that rabbit hole. And Nate, the other thing I wanted to point out is that it reminded me of a thought experiment that Dean Oliver proposes in his book on basketball. It's called Basketball on Paper. And this book came out almost 25 years ago. But he said, if you wanted to truly find out who the best basketball player is, what you would do is you would have every player in the league sort of jump into this pool and get randomly assigned to different teams. And then as a team would win and a team would lose, you would swap the players out and you would get every different combination of all the different players to play together. And eventually the best players would elevate and would distinguish themselves from the rest. And then you would sort of start dropping off the low impact players and only have the high impact players. And then eventually you get to this tournament where you just have the 5 most high impact players on either side play each other. And that would be truly determining who the best player is. So, people have been thinking along these lines, right? Like right. It's fun. And I do think it'd be a new category. It'd be a new way of evaluating sports, or the hypothetical GOAT.
Yeah, right. I like it, man. Great. Yeah. Great stuff. And yeah, you're right. It's stuff that we've been casually speculating about forever, as long as there's been sports fans, right? And some people, as you've mentioned, have put a lot more thought into it. And that's, some of the analytics that you talked about, that's ultimately what they're really trying to do too. And so it's just an extension of some of that stuff, for sure. So thinking now a little bit about, kind of cultural movements and cultural dynamics and impacts on the hobby. So, one of the things that we hear a ton about and we all battle, I'm sure to some degree, is screen time. Right. And, that's, I think, continues to accelerate. AI is creating some, new categories of things along those lines. We hear the term now AI slop, right? Which is the proliferation of images, content, information, music, all different types of content on the internet, via digital means. And we're, starting to see more and more of that. We may be headed toward a point where if there's not some regulation, kind of inundated by that in our digital lives. So I've started to see some things about backlash to that, right? Like just one example I had recently, I sit on a local art and history museum board of directors, and I was talking to some of the managers recently. We're going to be doing a history museum expansion and talking about some concepts for it. And the big trends had been to like digitize all the data and make everything electronic and accessible. You'd come in and get on a screen and, you know, learn that way. But what I was hearing from some of our staff is the big movement now is to make everything immersive and tactile, because what people in the community want, especially parents, is get the kids off the screens, get the kids off the internet, put them in situations where they need to interact, make them touch things. Like, we're already kind of starting to have some of that. And I would think there's going to be growth in that type of mindset. Our hobby would seem to set up pretty well for that. We have these physical objects, these historical artifacts that we can hold in our hands. We have card shows that are very social and interactive. I could see a dynamic potentially where our hobby benefits from some of the backlash to the digitization that we're all dealing with. So Chris, any thoughts on where, like, could that bring more collectors to us? Are parents going to say, go get cards, get your ass off the screen and go to a card? Or is that like, am I thinking too positively about that potential reaction?
Parents have been doing that since at least when I was a kid. You know,
Yeah.
you get out, you need to go outside and play, and you can come back when it's dark.
Mhm.
And I was listening to a podcast by Tyler Cowan, who's a professor at George Mason University. And he said he gives his students the option now to take their classes with him by AI. And he is concerned that sooner than later, a lot of college level courses are going to be mostly taught by AI or self-taught by students and aided by AI. And he said, so his pivot is a very simple one. He's going to just pivot into giving in-person talks, giving in-person lectures where people actually come to hear what he has to say, and him in particular in his authentic voice. And they want the experience of being in the room with him. And the point isn't to learn something that is standardized, but instead to get something unique from him. And he said he's going to the in-person. The in-person is where the competitive advantage still lies for human beings, at least for now. And I think that has tremendous intellectual spillover into the hobby. I think the local card shop is very well positioned to absorb people who are seeking the in-person. The card show is very well positioned to absorb people who still want the in-person. The card itself, the tactile nature, is positioned very well as an alternative against screen time. And I always found the similarity in the size of a slab versus the size of an iPhone to be interesting too. The iPhone almost is preparing me to have my neck craned and looking at something, but instead of the phone, I'm looking at the card. So I do think that the physical nature of cards, even if that seems a little counterintuitive in an increasingly digital age, the physical tactile nature of cards and the in-person communication that can come attached with it is I think this era actually is going to create a premium for those experiences.
There's a few trends that I've been watching that are trends in the behavior of Gen Zs. When I think about my own generation, I'm a late Gen Xer. Nate, I think you are too.
Yeah.
And I in some ways, I think the boomers and the Gen Xers in this digital transition are worse behaved than younger generations, because it's kind of like we're too old to be worth kind of training out of the digital addictions that we've all created. But we're seeing a few things with Gen Zers that's pretty interesting to me. One, the flip phone has reemerged. And it's because in that generation, they call it digital detoxing. And they realize we just need to go out and be face to face with our friends, like at a coffee shop, and talking and not staring at our phones. And, you know, I think my wife and I over time have just gotten terrible at having our phones at dinner and stuff. And so I think younger generations, and this gives me optimism in humanity, that we can understand how to use amazing digital technologies like AI, but also go outside and touch grass or take your flip phone instead. The other trend is that for the first time since 1983, vinyl record sales in the US in 2025 surpassed $1 billion. And actually, vinyl record sales for the last 19 years have been slowly on the rise. And there is no reason whatsoever for anybody to need to listen to music on a super high friction experience as a vinyl record, other than wanting to physically own an object And these are by and large Taylor Swift fans, for example. These are young people that are some of the sales, a pretty high portion, I think, are people that don't even have a record player, but also who want to have the experience of actually pulling out the record, putting it on, sitting and listening. And I just think I'm an optimist that in the history of kind of how humanity has digitized everything, it's not just a one-way street. And in fact, we'll realize, no, in some ways we need human experiences. We need to go outside. We need to hold objects. And I'm a total optimist on how it's going to play out. And I'm very bullish on the importance of physical things and possessions, and that there's something very human in that. And there's even a relational aspect in being able to give someone else a physical thing that was yours. And even in the buying and selling in this hobby, relationships are built. So I think it's really important. It's a great question, and I'm all in on it.
Awesome. Yeah. Great stuff. I'm gonna take the other angle here. I'm actually in the process of selling off most of my collection to go into NFTs in the metaverse. wasn't that gonna overtake all collectibles a few years ago?
Yeah,
that was the plan.
You should buy some of those Bored Ape artworks. They're going to be all the rage.
I haven't checked any NFT indexes in a while. Have they been continuing to plummet, or have they?
I don't think you're looking so pretty right now.
Are there indexes?
No, you know what? We call that a buying opportunity, actually.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The backlash, right. It was kind of fun to see that happen once already, right? Like, is everything going to go digital, and is there a place for the physical? And at least, and
what I loved what Jonathan was saying was that it really like crystallized for me, maybe for the first time I really saw it this way, that we've gone from needing to be in person to do things, like to take a course or to whatever, to talk to our friends, to not needing to be in person to do that, to having digital tools to do that, to now the only reason we would be in person is genuinely just because we want to. So the everything, the mindset of that is completely different. Now I'm no longer obligated to be here. I'm only here because I want to be here. And I think that's a totally different way of life. And it will be interesting to be in a society full of people who actually are there because they want to be there and not because they have to be there.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And it's even true with work now, right? Like so many people could do what they do remotely, and a tremendous number of them choose to come together and congregate every day to do it in person. It's interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
So to get into maybe even a more kind of speculative area than that, how about potential wealth impacts that are on the horizon? We hear one of the biggest themes we hear about with AI is potential job displacement. We hear about the creation of trillionaires potentially being, pretty close around the corner. So kind of this barbell effect, right? Where you've got kind of a lot of people at the top end, maybe more and younger millionaires and billionaires who are successfully leveraging this technology early on, and maybe some people who are displaced early on who, have lost their jobs to digitization. We don't know. Nobody knows, obviously. I think, we've all heard a lot about what could happen here, but any thoughts on how this could impact the hobby? And, I guess on the upper end, with more money, more disposable income, more investable liquid assets to put into things like collectibles, you could maybe have a case that there could be some more capital coming in. On the lower end, maybe there's some concern. Are we going to lose, if there is real job displacement, are we going to lose lower middle class families having that disposable income to get their kids access to things like collectibles and cards? And might we lose some collectors that way? So I don't know. Those are some of the kind of higher level potential thoughts I've had. Chris, any reactions in terms of where this could head, good or bad for the hobby?
So many. Okay, so first of all, the soon-to-be trillionaires, the smart ones are promising some sort of UBI,
Yeah.
and they are sounding that now.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
what's the alternative, right? All the people get together and say, hey, you know what? What if we just tax you a lot and then give it to ourselves? What are you going to do about it? So
Yeah.
I think sounding the UBI alarm is good. And then the other thing I think about is the idea of utopia. And the idea of utopia is thought of a lot by people who love video games. And that specific niche of, and I'm not one of those people, but that specific niche of people play video games all the time, and they've come up with some really clever ways to justify spending so much time playing video games. And so some of the leaders in that space are a guy named Professor Bernard Suits, who wrote the book something about utopia. I think it's called The Grasshopper. And then there's a professor now, I think the University of Utah, named Professor Wynn, who he sort of takes Suits and he channels it into this topic, and it applies to cards too, especially in a utopia or in a post-work society. And he says this. He says, if all your basic needs are taken care of, like if you have shelter, if you have food, if you have access to medical care anytime you need it, if you really don't have any pressing needs, or, you know, essentially if you're in a sort of a utopia where you have all this time, you can do whatever you want with it, you really would have two options. You would either play games or you would be bored. Those are the two things you could do. And so I think if cards can be classified as a game, I think that we might see a lot more people playing that game. We might see a lot more people deciding to use their time, their leisure time, to participate in the great joy of card collecting and in the great joy of navigating the market and finding opportunities and so on and so forth. So I think that can happen. But what does it actually mean for the market if we are sort of in this post-work world? Like, does anybody really have any money? Do cards sort of like all lose a ton of value except for at the very high end, maybe? Or, you know, it's really hard to imagine. But I do think that there will be, I actually think that there's a good case to be made that the further we move from needing to spend a lot of our time, you know, doing work and labor that we otherwise wouldn't do, the further we move away from that, the closer we move towards things that are fun games that we like to enjoy, the more those things will become elevated, and the more we'll take a pleasure in pursuing them.
I love that take. I only have two things to add. One, I've seen from my professional world a lot of high-end art collectors, sports card collectors, memorabilia collectors come from wealthy technology, innovation, venture capital, you know, all of that ecosystem, the same ecosystem that's innovating around AI. And so I think we're already seeing in what's going on in the middle to high end of the hobby, all kinds of capital that's come in over the past few decades. I think that'll continue. I think that's overall been good for the hobby. I have an optimistic take on this wave of innovation and how it'll impact jobs over time. I think jobs will change. I think a lot of jobs will go away, like the phone operator. And I think a whole lot of new jobs that we can't even envision now will be created in a competitive system where everyone has the same tools. I still think humans are going to be the differentiator. So, but if I'm wrong, I like where Chris was going about having state provided income for everyone.
Man, I hope you're right, Jonathan. I don't know. I'm a little less optimistic on that one personally, but we've always figured it out in the past. The question is this technological leap different than all the other ones?
Yep.
Gonna be a very interesting time to see. But yeah, Chris, to your point as well, we also, you know, we just lived through a test case of all this, right? Which was COVID. We all kind of pulled back and we were in our homes, and for a while we didn't have as much to do as we always had. And what did we do? You know, Jonathan and I are COVID babies in the hobby, right? Getting back in during that period.
Yep.
There are a tremendous number of us who all of a sudden stopped and took a break from our busy lives and said, wow, this hobby's awesome. Let's get this rolling again. And there could be some real parallels there if we all find ourselves with more free time, either because, and there's a case maybe where Jonathan, your view is part of it as well, which is we're there's not mass job displacement, but instead we all continue to make good incomes, and we do it in 20 hours of work instead of 40, right? Or 12 hours of work in a week, and our AI agents do the rest, and we're all freed up to have a tremendous amount of time to pursue hobbies and exercise and social gatherings and other things that we enjoy.
Definitely.
Yeah. So moving toward wrapping up, I guess, I've heard, I think maybe almost a surprising amount of optimism. I think I share it. It's kind of encouraging for me to hear that you guys feel pretty optimistic about a lot of these dynamics as well. Any kind of final wrap-up thoughts as we come to the end here? Anything stand out to you guys as key takeaways? Again, I think we've all acknowledged we've lived a lot tonight in hypothetical and speculative world. So I don't think we've really tried to offer definitive answers, but I think, we've hit on some interesting things. So just wondering, in terms of kind of final thoughts, Jonathan, anything leap out for you?
Yeah, I want Chris to get the last word on this, but as I thought about what else could AI do, and it is on the theme of optimism, something that would make the hobby a lot better. I feel like there's so much opportunity to more efficiently just connect buyers and sellers of cards. Or even, so I heard somebody recently talk about eBay should have a feature where you list the card that you want so a seller can come find you. But I think right now we live in a world where there's some fairly closed platforms where the house always wins and the house takes a lot, where, in this world of collectors, and sometimes we're doing this on Instagram, sometimes we're doing this on Twitter, but how can AI ultimately evolve things where buyers and sellers of cards can just easily find each other and transact? I think there's going to be all kinds of innovation around that we'll see take a lot of the inefficiency out of our hobby.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, that is one that we can all get on board with, right? I mean, that is, for me, I'd say maybe the main pain point, this fact that we have to pay this tax every time we transact. So if we could just find each other, the finding each other part isn't a tax, like that can actually be fun, but to have to pay the 10 or 15% every time. And that's part of the reason why I've been a little, sort of anti-consolidation, because I feel like you do like 3 layers of consolidation and all of a sudden you have like 70% of the value. So yeah, I love that take. Chris, final thoughts.
I'm going to just stay with me here. And I'm going to take the poetic license. I'm going to take the liberty to swing for the fences here. Or I don't know if that's quite the right metaphor. But here's what I think. Here's how I want to wrap up a discussion on AI. There's a lot of good content around AI. There's a lot of different points of view on it. There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of pessimism. There's a lot of really scary scenarios. And I'm going to continue, though, with the thread of optimism here. And I'm going to take it to its extreme, or at least one of the extremes. You could probably even get more extreme than this. There's a thinker who's been a prominent fixture in sort of science, sci-fi stuff. His name's Ray Kurzweil. And he's been talking about the singularity, quote unquote, for a long time. And that kind of means different things to different people. He sort of has his own definition of it that I won't go over here. But what I will point out about Ray is that Ray is in his mid to late 70s. He holds some prestigious position at Google that relates to artificial intelligence. He's gotten several books out. I've skimmed his most recent one, which is called The Singularity is Nearer. I will listen to any podcast appearance he makes because he has really far-reaching thoughts about where artificial intelligence is going to take us, and he thinks it's going to be very soon. And so some of his ideas are not just like, could a chatbot accurately retrieve sales if it had a clean API from Card Ladder? He's thinking like, when vaccines are being created, that they'll be able to be created almost instantly because of these biological simulations that can test the vaccine in 2 billion different ways, every hour. And some of the stuff that he's talking about, and he sort of made it a point that he takes the most health precautions of anybody ever, because he truly believes that escape velocity is right around the corner, and that medical advancement and that the sort of the promise of AI and its ability to sort of get to the point where we'll solve these problems of physics and biology that have stumped us, that we eventually probably would solve, but it would take a long time. He thinks that's going to accelerate. And that we're very close to a point where people are just going to continuously outlive whatever medical ailment plagues them, because the rate of advance in medicine is going to be that great. And that's sort of his short-term thinking, is like, we're really close to escape velocity being a reality for humans. But he says but what's around the corner is sort of the merging of machines, of computers, of artificial intelligence with the human body, with the human itself. He sort of writes and thinks about nodes, sort of a transhumanism concept, nodes being implanted in our brains that are going to magnify our ability to think by just untold multipliers, and that the mental processing and the abilities that we're going to have are going to be phenomenal. And he's thinking that's like a decade and a half away, and he's just trying to find all the ways possible to just make sure that he gets to that point. He foresees humans living hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, not save for the catastrophic physical, like if your body gets crushed, what can you do? But there are thinkers out there who once were on the fringe and who are coming closer and closer to the mainstream, who have painted these realities involving AI that sort of let us zoom out a bit and say, oh man, it would really stink if there was like a rough transition of a year, 2 or 3 years, people get displaced, maybe, don't have a job for a while, have to live off your savings, or maybe it could even get worse. You have to move in with family if you have that, or who knows, it could get ugly for people. But the bigger picture, the broader possibility of what AI technology can provide are these like incredibly grand things that, what if we're all together on a stream, and I know this is far-fetched, 100 years from now talking about collecting baseball cards, like then everything else that we discussed is almost like a moot point. So
it's all vintage then.
It's all vintage then. So that I want to end on just a really crazy, far-fetched note. And if that's interesting, check out Ray Kurzweil. He's a great listen on any podcast.
I love it, man. What a beautiful ending point. And may we be on in 100 years to check on our speculations, or at least come back in a couple and see how we did. But
I'm glad we gave Chris the last word.
Yes, me too. Yeah, phenomenal, Chris. Knew it'd be awesome to have you on. It was even better than expected, guys. Great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Great ideas. And Chris, I hope we can have you back sometime and maybe do something a little more free ranging in the hobby. It was fun to go deep on one topic. I feel like that's a little more rare in a lot of the content that we hear now. But it'd be fun to do something that where we can kind of fly around a little bit as well. But this was cool.
Anytime, buddy.
Awesome. All right. Well, fellas, thanks for staying up late. Good time, great conversation, and look forward to being in touch.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
See you guys.
Take care.